The city's skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a postcard view that diners paid a fortune to ignore. Inside the orchid room, the real show was the quiet, expensive hum of perfection. The air smelled of seared scallops, wilted lemon, and money. Soft light glowed from minimalist fixtures, catching the shimmer of wine in crystal glasses and the sharp glint of polished silverware. Every sound was cushioned by thick carpets and heavy damask drapes, the clink of cutlery, the murmur of conversation. All part of a carefully controlled symphony dot in this world of dark suits and cocktail dresses. The staff moved like ghosts. They were present but unseen, a swirl of black vests and white shirts, their faces schooled into masks of polite neutrality. Among them was a woman. She was in her late 20s, with hair the color of dark honey, pulled into a severe, practical knot at the nape of her neck. A few stubborn strands always escaped, framing a face that was watchful and calm. Her name tag, pinned neatly above her heart, read Clara. But to the guests, she was just Waitress. She moved with an efficient grace, a tray balanced high on one palm, navigating the tight spaces between tables without seeming to rush. Her eyes did the hard work. She saw the lifted finger of a man wanting another bourbon before he had to voice it. She noticed the slight frown of a woman whose water glass was a quarter empty. She anticipated needs, smoothed over small inconveniences, and made the complex machinery of the restaurant run without a squeak dot tonight. Her section included the prime booth by the window, a semicircle of plush velvet that commanded a view of the entire room. It was occupied by a party of 4, and at the center of it, holding court, was a man whose confidence seemed to be a physical presence, like his own personal lighting. He was in his 50s, with silver streaks at his temples and a suit that probably cost more than Clara's car. His laugh was a loud, sharp bark that cut through the room's muted symphony. He was a regular, known to the managers by name, and treated with a deference that bordered on reverence. He was a venture capitalist, a maker of fortunes and breaker of dreams. And he never let anyone forget it. His name was not important to Clara. He was table 9. As Clara approached with a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon, priced at $300 a bottle, she caught the tail end of his conversation. The restaurant's resident pianist, a talented young man playing gentle jazz standards, had just finished a Cole Porter number and taken his break. The sleek, black grand piano sat silent under a small spotlight, its lid propped open like a sleeping bird's wing. Finally, the man at table 9 said, waving a dismissive hand toward the empty stool, "A moment of peace. Background music is one thing, but must it be so present?" One of his companions, a younger man trying hard to impress, chuckled on cue. "It's just filler, really. Sets a mood." "The mood it sets," the venture capitalist said. Leaning back and accepting the glass of wine, Clara poured with a nod he didn't direct at her. "Is the mood of a hotel lobby. Pleasant, forgettable, a decoration with sound." He took a sip, swirled the wine in his glass, and surveyed the room as if he owned every brick of it. True artistry, the kind that commands a room, that's a rarity. You don't find it in places like this, hired by the hour. Clara's expression didn't change. She had heard it all before comments on the wine, the food, the decor, the other guests. The rich often talked about the world around them, as if it were a show put on for their exclusive review. She finished pouring, murmured, "Enjoy," and retreated to her service station. But his words, about artistry that commands a room, they stuck with her. They echoed in a quiet, dusty corner of her mind she usually kept locked. Her hands, which now wiped the rim of a water pitcher, were once trained for a different purpose. Her fingers, which could stack 3 dirty plates along her forearm with perfect balance, knew another kind of weight and geography, the ivory landscape of piano keys. She pushed the thought away. That was another life. A life of practice rooms that smelled of dust and ambition, of blistering critiques and standing ovations, of a future that felt as certain as sunrise. Then life happened. A sick parent needing care, mounting debts that scholarships didn't cover, a slow, painful realization that the path to a concert stage was a narrow bridge with no guardrails. She had stepped off that bridge to solid, grinding ground. The piano became a memory, a private sorrow she carried inside her chest. The dinner rush was winding down. The clatter from the kitchen softened to a steady hum. Table 9 was ordering dessert, an expensive port. The pianist's break was stretching longer than usual. The silence around the grand piano began to feel heavy, noticeable. Guests glanced at it, expecting the music to return and fill the comfortable space. Clara felt a strange pull in her gut. It was a physical yearning, an ache in her fingers. The piano wasn't just a piece of furniture. Under the spotlight, it looked lonely. It had been years since she'd played on anything but the cheap electronic keyboard in her tiny apartment. The volume kept low so as not to bother the neighbors. A reckless thought, clear and sharp, cut through her tiredness. What if? She immediately shoved it down. It was insane. She was in her work uniform. She had tables. She hadn't performed for anyone in nearly a decade. The very idea made her palms damp. But the pull was magnetic. The memory of the venture capitalist's smug voice dismissing the previous pianist as filler mixed with the older, deeper memory of the one thing that had ever made her feel truly, completely alive. It was a dangerous cocktail. She watched as Table 9 threw his head back and laughed at his own joke, the sound booming across the room. He was so sure of his place in the world, so sure of his right to judge everything in it. In that moment, the piano stopped being an object of fear and became something else. A challenge. A secret door. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic rhythm completely at odds with her calm exterior. This was a terrible idea. She could lose her job. She would be humiliated. The man at Table 9 would probably laugh her right out of the room. Yet her feet were moving. She set down her tray on the service stand with a soft, final click. She smoothed her hands down the front of her black vest, as if she could press the nervous flutter in her stomach into stillness. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't ask for permission. She simply walked, her sensible work shoes silent on the carpet, across the open floor towards the gleaming, silent grand piano. A few diners noticed. A woman with a spoonful of creme brulee paused, watching the waitress approach the stage. A busboy near the kitchen door stopped, a stack of dishes in his hands. And then, from the velvet booth, came the sound. A short, derisive snort of laughter. It was the venture capitalist. He had seen her. He leaned over to his companions, his voice not even attempting to be quiet, meant to be heard. "Well, look at this," he announced, a wide, mocking grin spreading across his face. Ambition strikes in the most unexpected places. The help is going to serenade us. This ought to make for a better story than the food. His friends chuckled, turning in their seats to watch the impending, amusing disaster. Clara heard every word. They felt like small stones hitting her back. For a second, she almost stopped. Her cheeks burned. Every instinct screamed to turn around, to pick up her tray, to fade back into the wallpaper. But she was already at the piano. The grand, polished curve of it loomed before her. The keys, a sea of white and black, seemed to wait. She could feel the eyes of the entire restaurant on her, the curious, the amused, the judgmental. She took a deep, shaky breath that no one saw. She pulled out the padded stool and sat down. The leather sighed under her weight. The spotlight was warm on her neck. She ignored the whispers, the lingering chuckle from Table 9. She blocked out the room, the job, the years of silence. She let her hands hover over the keys, and for the first time in a very long time, she remembered not who she was, but who she had been. And then she began to play. The first thing she did was not play a note. She sat there, her back straight in her simple black work clothes, facing the vast, silent expanse of the piano. The room had gone completely quiet, save for the faint clink of a glass from the distant bar. All the air seemed to have been sucked out, replaced by a thick, waiting silence. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. From his booth, the venture capitalist let out another low chuckle, this one full of anticipation for the coming joke. He shifted in his seat, getting comfortable for the show. He nodded toward her as if to say to his friends, "Just watch." Her hands, resting lightly on her knees under the lip of the piano, were trembling. She could feel the fine vibration in her fingertips. They weren't the smooth, cared-for hands of a concert pianist anymore. They were the hands of a waitress, with a small burn from a hot plate on her thumb and a callus on her finger from carrying heavy trays. For a terrifying second, her mind went blank. It was like staring into a deep, dark well. All those years of training, all the music she had memorized, it had vanished. All she could think was, asterisk, what have I done? Asterisk, she closed her eyes. She blocked out the light, the shapes of the people, the weight of their stares. She listened instead to the memory of a sound. Not the sound of this restaurant, but the sound of her old teacher's studio. It had smelled of wood polish and old paper. She could almost hear his voice, gruff but kind. The music is not in your head, girl. It's in your hands. Let them remember. Your head will only get in the way. Slowly, she lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. The cool, smooth ivory was a shock, a feeling so intensely familiar it was like touching a piece of her own past. It was a physical memory. Her right thumb found middle C. It was just a point of contact. A home base in a world that had felt unmoored for years. She took one more breath, deep and steady, and let it out. Then she pressed down dot. It wasn't a melody. It was a single, rich, complex chord. A deep, resonant gathering of notes from the lower part of the piano that didn't ring out so much as bloom in the quiet room. It was a dark, questioning sound, full of shadow and depth. It didn't tinkle. It vibrated in the floorboards. It hung in the air, heavy and important, for a long moment before fading. The smirk on the venture capitalist's face froze. It wasn't the silly little tune he was expecting. This was a different language altogether. Before the sound had fully died, her left hand began a slow walking pattern down in the bass, a purposeful, rhythmic pulse. It was the sound of footsteps in an empty hall. It was a heartbeat. Then her right hand came in, not with a simple tune, but with a cascade of high, clear, bell-like notes that danced over that steady pulse. The notes were incredibly fast, precise, and sparkling. Like water catching sunlight, it was the beginning of Franz Liszt's La Campanella, one of the most fiendishly difficult pieces ever written for the piano. It was a piece meant to sound like 1,000 tiny bells, a test of agility, control, and sheer nerve. It was not something you played on a dare. It was something you dedicated years of your life to mastering. And she was mastering it. Transformation in her was absolute. The woman who had sat down, nervous and stiff, was gone. In her place was someone completely in command. Her shoulders relaxed. Her head tilted slightly, listening to the harmonies she was creating. Her eyes were open now, but they weren't seeing the restaurant. They were fixed on some distant point, watching the music unfold in her mind's eye. A faint, focused smile touched her lips, not for the audience, but for the private joy of reunion. Her hands were a blur. They leaped and crossed over each other with impossible grace. The fast sections were a whirlwind of accuracy, every note a sharp, perfect diamond. The slow, singing melodies that emerged from the storm were heart-stoppingly beautiful, played with a tenderness that made people forget to breathe. She wasn't just hitting the right notes. She was telling a story with them. A story of longing, of brilliance, of a fierce, wild joy dot in the booth. The venture capitalist's glass of port was forgotten, halfway to his mouth. His arm had gotten tired holding it there. The amused gleam in his eye had been snuffed out, replaced by a slow dawning shock. He was a man who knew about value. He could look at a startup and within minutes put a number on its worth. He could assess a person's pedigree, their suit, their speech, and categorize them. This defied all his categories. This was not a waitress showing off. This was a world-class artist who happened to be wearing a waitress uniform. He felt a hot, prickling sensation start at the back of his neck and creep up over his scalp. His earlier words played back in his head, loud and cringing. Asterisk, the help is going to serenade us. A decoration with sound. Each arrogant pronouncement now felt like a slap he had given himself. He had been so loud, so sure. He had made sure everyone around him had heard his contempt. Now, that contempt was boomeranging back, and it was settling in the pit of his stomach as a sour, heavy shame. He glanced at his companions. They weren't looking at him anymore. They were transfixed by the woman at the piano. The younger man who had laughed along with him earlier had his mouth slightly open, his face a mask of pure wonder. There was no shared joke in their eyes now. There was only awe, and it was directed entirely at her. He looked around the room. Every single person was captivated. The other waitstaff had gathered in the shadowy doorway to the kitchen, their order pads forgotten. The chefs, in their stained whites, were peering through the service window. The maître d', a severe man who prized silence, had tears glistening in his eyes. An elderly couple at a nearby table were holding hands, their wrinkled faces soft with emotion. He was completely alone in his humiliation, isolated in a room full of people, united by the beauty they were witnessing. He wanted to shrink, to disappear into the velvet of the booth. The grand piano was no longer a piece of furniture. It was a throne, and she was ruling it. The music built and built, climbing to a fever pitch of technical brilliance. Her fingers were a machine of perfect motion, yet the sound was anything but mechanical. It was alive, passionate, desperate. It was the sound of something locked away, finally breaking free. The final few bars were a breathtaking sprint, a series of runs and chords that seemed to defy human limitation. And then, with two final, defiant, perfectly timed chords, asterisk, bang. Bang! Asterisk, it was over. The last note didn't just fade. It seemed to get swallowed by the stunned silence that followed. For a long, long moment, no one moved. No one clapped. No one even breathed. They were all still trapped in the world she had built out of sound. Then, as if waking from a dream, the elderly couple began to applaud. It was a slow, heartfelt clap, and it broke the spell. The room erupted. It wasn't polite dinner applause. It was a roaring, standing ovation. People pushed back their chairs and got to their feet, their faces alight. The kitchen staff whooped from the doorway. The sound was thunderous, a physical wave of appreciation that crashed over the small stage. Through it all, the woman at the piano simply sat for a second, her head bowed, her shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath. She looked drained, but there was a peace on her face that hadn't been there before. She had done it. She had faced the well, and instead of finding it empty, she had found her old self waiting there, still whole. She stood up, turned to the room, and gave a small, humble, almost shy nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't the bow of a performer seeking praise. It was the gesture of someone saying a quiet thank you for being allowed to remember who she was. Then, without a word, she stepped off the little platform and walked back onto the main floor. The applause followed her, but she didn't milk it. She went straight to her service station, picked up her tray where she had left it, and checked her order pad, as if she needed to remember what Table 6 had ordered for dessert. The venture capitalist watched her do this simple, ordinary return to duty. It was the most extraordinary thing he had seen all night. The applause was still ringing in his ears, a stark contrast to the sound of his own laughter from just minutes before. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that he had to say something. The weight of his own regret was too heavy to carry out of the room. He had to try somehow to put things right. The applause was like a living thing. It swelled and filled the orchid room, bouncing off the high ceilings and the glass windows. It was loud, insistent, and full of genuine wonder. People were not just clapping. They were smiling, shaking their heads in disbelief, talking excitedly to each other. The sound wrapped around the woman in the waitress uniform as she stood by her service station, her tray held loosely in her hands. She felt the noise more than heard it. Her ears were still ringing with the final, powerful chords of the piece, her muscles humming with the ghost of the effort. The applause felt like it was for someone else, for the person she had been a decade ago, who had just stepped out of a memory and into the spotlight for 3 blistering minutes. The person holding the tray right now, with the order for 2 decaf coffees and a creme brulee, was just Clara. Her cheeks were warm. Her heart was still beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but now it was mixed with a flood of relief so profound it made her legs feel weak. Asterisk, she had done it, and she hadn't fallen apart. Asterisk, she gave the room one more small, self-conscious nod, her eyes scanning the crowd without really seeing faces. Then, with a discipline forged from years of getting the job done no matter what, she turned her back on the ovation. The applause began to slowly die down, shifting into a buzz of excited conversation. She heard snippets. Unbelievable. Who is she? Like something from a movie. She focused on her tray. She needed to deliver the coffees before they got cold. The mundane task was an anchor, pulling her back from the dizzying heights of the performance. As she walked toward Table 6, she could feel dozens of eyes following her. It was a different kind of attention than before. Before, she was invisible. Now, she was the most visible person in the room. It was unsettling. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement from the velvet booth. The venture capitalist was standing up. The easy, sprawled confidence he'd had all evening was gone. His movements were stiff, almost hesitant. He said something low to his companions, who were still seated and looking stunned, and then he started walking. Not toward the exit, but directly toward her. A fresh spike of nerves shot through her. Oh no, here it comes, she thought. Maybe he was furious. Maybe he thought she'd ruined the atmosphere of his expensive dinner. Maybe he was going to complain to the manager. She braced herself, keeping her eyes on the cups of coffee on her tray, trying to look busy and unapproachable, but he didn't cut her off or raise his voice. He simply altered his path to intercept hers, arriving at the edge of her station, just as she was setting down the tray after serving Table 6. He stood there, waiting. He was a tall man, used to taking up space, but in that moment he seemed oddly diminished. The spotlight that had been on her seemed to have left him in a shadow of his own making. She had no choice but to look up at him. She kept her face neutral, the polite, professional mask she used for difficult customers. "Can I help you, sir? More port?" He flinched almost imperceptibly at the formal sir. He cleared his throat. The loud, booming voice was gone. When he spoke, it was quieter, rougher around the edges. "That. What you just played." He paused, searching for words. This was a man who gave speeches without notes, who commanded boardrooms. Now he was struggling. "That was not what I was expecting." She just looked at him, waiting. She wouldn't make this easy for him. She wouldn't offer a smile or a thanks. The memory of his loud, mocking laugh was still too fresh. He swallowed. I owe you an apology. A significant one. The words seemed to cost him something. My behavior before. My comments. They were rude. And more than that, they were profoundly wrong. He glanced away, his eyes flicking toward the grand piano, then back to her. There was a new intensity in his gaze now. It wasn't the look of someone examining a piece of furniture or an employee. It was the look of someone who had just had a fundamental assumption shattered. He was seeing her for the first time. Where did you learn to play like that? He asked. The question wasn't asked with doubt, but with a kind of hungry curiosity. That piece. It's not just difficult. It's legendary. You played it with? I've heard professionals play it in concert halls. You were their equal. More than equal. There it was. The question she hadn't been asked in years. The simple question that opened the door to a past life. For a second, she considered giving him the brush off. Just some lessons as a kid. She could walk away, let him sit with his apology and his confusion. It would be satisfying, in a way. But something in his face stopped her. It wasn't just shame. There was a real stunned respect there. He wasn't pretending. The music had reached past his arrogance and touched something else. She let out a slow breath. The fight-or-flight tension began to seep from her shoulders. I went to Juilliard, she said, her voice flat. She said it not as a boast, but as a simple, distant fact, like stating what year she was born. His eyes widened. Juilliard. The name hung in the air between them. It was one of the most famous music schools in the world. The pinnacle. It explained everything and nothing at the same time. Juilliard, he repeated, almost to himself. Then the obvious, bewildered question tumbled out. What are you doing here? A wry, tired smile touched her lips for the first time. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had answered this question in her own head 1,000 times. Life, she said simply. It's a long story. A sick parent. Debts that scholarships don't cover. She shrugged a little, picking up a clean cloth to wipe the already spotless counter of her station. The hours here are flexible. The pay covers the bills. A job. He stared at her, his businessman's mind trying and failing to compute the staggering mismatch of value. A Juilliard-trained virtuoso, waiting tables. It was like finding a race car engine in a golf cart. It offended his every instinct about talent, investment, and return. But your talent. He began, his voice rising with something like frustration. It's an asset. A rare one. It should be your life. She stopped wiping and looked directly at him. Her gaze was clear and calm. It was my life. For a long time. Then I had to build a different one. The piano. She glanced toward the instrument. It's still mine. It's just private now. Or it was, until about 5 minutes ago. Her words silenced him. He heard the finality in them, the quiet acceptance of a hard choice made long ago. This wasn't a tragedy playing out. This was a person who had made peace with a difficult reality. Her strength wasn't just in her fingers. It was in her posture, in her steady eyes. He, who broke companies and built fortunes, felt strangely humbled by this quiet strength. He was silent for a long minute, just standing there as the restaurant swirled around them, bussers clearing tables, the bartender mixing drinks, the low murmur of post-performance chatter. I run a venture fund, he said finally, the words coming out in a rush. We invest in potential, in exceptional people. He seemed almost embarrassed by his own offer, as if realizing how crude it sounded to put a price on what he'd just witnessed. There must be a way. A grant, a sponsorship, to get you back on stage, where you belong. That talent shouldn't be hidden. She listened, her head tilted. It was a generous offer, she knew. From a man like him, it was probably a life-changing one. For a second, she let herself imagine it. The practice, the pressure, the spotlight that was a career. Not just a fleeting moment, but the image felt like an old, ill-fitting coat. The woman who wanted that life was younger, unburdened. The woman she was now had different responsibilities, a different kind of peace. She smiled, a real small smile this time. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. "That's very kind. But I'm not looking for an investor, and I'm not sure I'm looking for a stage." She picked up her tray again, a signal that the conversation and the extraordinary interruption to her shift was over. "I have a composition notebook at home that's almost full. That's where my music lives now. And honestly, after tonight, that feels like enough." She gave him one last, polite nod. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, sir." And with that, she walked away, heading toward the kitchen to check on the dessert order for table 8. She left him standing alone amid the clatter and murmur of the restaurant. A wealthy and powerful man, holding nothing but an apology and an offer that had just been gently, firmly set aside. The lesson was complete, and it was deeper than he had ever imagined. He stood there for a long moment, watching her walk away. She moved with the same quiet efficiency as before, but everything about her seemed different to him now. The way she held her tray, the tilt of her head as she listened to a diner's question, it all seemed to carry a secret, a hidden depth he'd been too blind to see. The applause had fully faded, replaced by the restaurant's normal sounds, but to his ears, the air still seemed to vibrate. He walked back to his booth in a daze. His companions, two junior partners and a potential client, were buzzing with the energy of what they'd just seen. That was absolutely incredible. The younger man, the one who had laughed along earlier, exclaimed. His face was flushed. "I've never seen anything like that in my life. Did you hear those runs?" It was like her fingers weren't even touching the keys. The venture capitalist just nodded, sliding back into his seat. The plush velvet felt unfamiliar, as if he'd left and come back a different person. He picked up his glass of port, but the rich, sweet taste felt cloying now. He set it down. "She said she went to Juilliard," he said, his voice low. A stunned silence fell over the table. The word landed with the weight it deserved. Juilliard? The potential client, a stern-looking woman in a sharp suit, repeated. "And she's working here? That's a catastrophic waste of capital." She said it like it was a business failure, which, in her world, it was. He nodded again, but the business analogy felt hollow, even insulting. This wasn't a failed investment. It was a human story, and he was realizing he didn't have the right spreadsheet to understand it. He had offered money, the tool he used to fix everything, and she had quietly refused it. Not out of pride, he sensed, but out of something much more solid. A different set of priorities. For the rest of their desserts, his companions chattered about the performance, analyzing it like it was a stock that had suddenly skyrocketed. He barely heard them. His mind was stuck on two images, the fierce, transcendent joy on her face as she played, and the calm, settled resolve in her eyes when she told him about her composition notebook. He was a man who dealt in futures. He bet on potential. He had looked at her and seen a buried asset, a stranded resource he could, with his money and influence, unlock and return to its proper market. But she had gently shown him that he was wrong. Her talent wasn't stranded. It had been relocated. It was alive and well, not on a concert stage, but in the quiet of her own home, on the pages of a notebook. Its value was defined by her, not by an audience or a ticket price. This was a new, unsettling thought. It challenged the very core of how he measured worth. When the bill came, he automatically reached for his black credit card, but his hand hesitated. The gesture felt empty, even vulgar. Tipping a percentage on a meal seemed absurd after what had transpired. What was the proper tip for a lesson in humility? What was the price of having your worldview quietly dismantled? He paid the bill, adding a generous tip that felt meaningless. As his group stood to leave, he found his eyes searching for her. She was at a table by the window, presenting a check to a couple. She was smiling, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes as the woman complimented the food. She looked content, not like someone trapped in the wrong life, but like someone fully present in the one she had. He felt a strange pull, not to offer her anything else, but to somehow acknowledge the shift that had happened in him. He couldn't just walk out. "Go ahead to the car," he said to his companions. "I'll be just a moment." He waited near the host stand, feeling awkward and out of place. He watched as she cleared the now empty table, her movements fluid and practiced. When she turned toward the kitchen with a loaded tray, he stepped forward, blocking her path just enough to be seen, but not enough to be a threat. She stopped and looked at him, her polite server's mask back in place, but her eyes were watchful. "I'm leaving," he said, stating the obvious. He fumbled for a moment, then reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out not a business card, but a simple, thick pen of brushed steel. It was expensive, but that wasn't why he carried it. It was the pen he used to sign deals that changed lives. It felt like the only honest thing he had on him. He held it out, not like a gift, but like an offering. I don't have the right words," he said, his voice gruff. "And I know you don't want my money or my connections. But you spoke about your compositions. This is just a pen. A good one. For your notebook." He saw her gaze drop to the pen. She didn't reach for it. She seemed to be weighing his intent. "It's not a contract," he added quickly, almost smiling at the absurdity. "No strings. It's just an acknowledgement that what you create in that notebook matters. Maybe it matters more than anything I've ever funded." Her posture softened. She looked from the pen to his face, and she saw the embarrassment and the sincerity warring there. The angry, blustering man from the booth was gone. In his place was someone trying clumsily to make a human connection. Slowly, she set her tray down on a nearby empty table. She reached out and took the pen. It was solid and cool in her hand. "Thank you," she said, and this time her voice was warmer, the professional edge gone. "That's very thoughtful." He nodded, a wave of relief passing through him. "The music tonight. It was the real thing. Thank you for that." He paused, then added, "And thank you for the lesson." He didn't specify what the lesson was. He didn't need to. A faint understanding passed between them. He turned and walked toward the exit. As the maître d' handed him his coat, he glanced back one last time. She had already put the pen in her vest pocket and was picking up her tray again, heading back to work. The extraordinary moment was over, folded back into the ordinary rhythm of the night. Walking out into the cool evening air, his companions were already dissecting a new business deal in the waiting car. He slid into the leather seat, but his mind was elsewhere. For years, his life had been a series of loud victories, closed deals, public accolades, the satisfying crush of a competitor. They were all about adding more money, more influence, more power. Tonight's victory was a quiet one, and it was about subtraction. A piece of his arrogance had been chipped away. A layer of assumption had been stripped back. He didn't feel smaller. He felt clearer. The city lights blurred past the car window, not as symbols of conquests to be had, but simply as lights, He realized she had given him a gift far greater than a performance. She had shown him that value isn't a public metric. It can be a private joy, a quiet act of creation, a choice made for reasons money can't define. And sometimes, the most powerful person in the room is not the one making the most noise, but the one who knows quietly and completely who they are. Back in the restaurant, the woman finished her shift. At the end of the night, as she was counting her tips at the service station, her fingers brushed against the solid weight of the pen in her pocket. She pulled it out, rolling it in her fingers. She thought of the man's stunned face, his awkward apology, his final, clumsy gift. She didn't smile in triumph. She felt no bitterness. She just felt a quiet sense of closure. A chapter from her past had finally been played out, not hidden away, and in doing so, it had lost some of its old, painful power. It was just music now. Her music. She put the pen away, took off her apron, and headed out into the night, thinking not of concert halls, but of her quiet apartment, her waiting keyboard, and the empty page in her notebook. For the first time in a long time, the silence ahead of her felt full of possibility, not of loss. The orchid room returned to itself. The last diners finished their drinks, paid their checks, and drifted out into the night, their conversations still sprinkled with, "Did you see?" And I couldn't believe my ears. The busboys cleared the final tables with a rhythmic clatter of china and glass. The lights were dimmed, leaving the grand piano a dark, silent silhouette in the empty room. For the woman, the rest of her shift passed in a soft, strange blur. The other servers gave her wide-eyed smiles and subtle thumbs-up as they passed. The stern Mater D paused by her station and said, simply, "That was a privilege to hear. Thank you," before moving on. The kitchen staff sent out a plate of the chef's favorite dessert, a rich chocolate torte, with, "For the artist," scrawled on the rim in raspberry sauce. She ate a few bites, the sweetness feeling unreal. She moved through her duties polishing wine glasses, refilling condiments, wiping down her stations on autopilot. Her body was tired, a deep, pleasant ache in her forearms and shoulders that she hadn't felt in years. It was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from using a long dormant part of yourself to its fullest dot at the end of the night. As she counted her tips at the service stand, her fingers brushed against the solid, cool weight of the pen in her vest pocket. She pulled it out, holding it under the small work light. It was a beautifully made object, heavy and precise. It felt like an artifact from another world, a world of boardrooms and big deals. But his words had brought it into hers. "Asterisk for your notebook." Asterisk, she put it carefully into her worn handbag, next to her keys and her phone. She changed out of her work clothes in the quiet staff room, hanging up the black vest and apron. In her simple jeans and sweater, she felt like herself again, but a self that had been subtly rearranged. The ghost of the piano keys still tingled in her fingertips. The walk to her apartment was short, through quiet city streets. The cool night air felt good on her face. For the first time in a long time, the memory of the piano didn't bring a sharp pang of loss. It felt resolved. She had faced it, not as a sad ghost of a dream, but as a living skill she still possessed. She had played for a room full of strangers and survived. More than survived, she had connected. The weight she had carried for years, the weight of what might have been, felt lighter. Her apartment was small, just a bedroom and a main room that served as a living room, kitchen, and studio. It was neat, but lived in. Books were stacked on a table. A single healthy plant thrived on the windowsill. And in the corner, next to a second-hand armchair, stood a digital keyboard on a sturdy stand, headphones draped over its edge. She made a cup of tea and sat in the armchair, looking at the keyboard. It was a good instrument, but it was not a grand piano. It had weighted keys to mimic the feel, but it was not the same. For years, it had been a symbol of compromise, of a great love diminished. Tonight, it just looked like her instrument. The instrument where she worked things out, where she composed, where she kept in touch with the language of music. She thought about the venture capitalist. His transformation had been almost as startling as her music. The bluster, then the shock, then the shame, and finally, that clumsy, sincere respect. He had tried to fit her into his worldview, a stranded asset, and when she didn't fit, he had been forced to change the shape of the worldview itself. That was a rare thing for anyone to do. She felt no anger toward him anymore. In a strange way, he had been a necessary part of the night. His mockery had been the push she needed. His stunned silence had been the proof she hadn't known she wanted. She finished her tea and walked over to the keyboard. She didn't put on the headphones. She just sat down on the simple stool and turned it on. The display glowed a soft blue. She placed her hands on the keys, the touch familiar and welcoming. She didn't play Liszt. She didn't play anything she had memorized long ago. Instead, she played a few chords, a little progression that had been circling in her head for days. It was a fragment of something new. She played it slowly, then changed a note, played it again. She reached for the composition notebook on the stand a symbol, spiral-bound book filled with her messy notations. She opened it to a fresh page. Then she reached into her bag and took out the heavy steel pen. She uncapped it. It glided across the paper smoothly, the ink a deep, dark blue. She began to write down the chords, the melody taking shape in ink, made permanent. This was her music. Not the music of a prodigy, or a Juilliard graduate, or a waitress. It was hers. Private, unfolding, honest. The pen felt good in her hand. It was a tool, not a trophy. Asterisk, 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 across town, the venture capitalist sat in his study, in a penthouse that offered a panoramic, silent view of the sleeping city. He had dismissed his driver and taken the elevator up alone. The quiet of the vast space was usually a comfort, a sign of his success. Tonight, it felt different. He had tried to read a financial report, but the numbers swam on the page. He had poured a drink, but left it untouched. The image that kept returning was not of the woman playing, though that was burned into his mind, but of her afterward, picking up her tray. The seamless shift from the sublime to the mundane. The absolute lack of drama. He thought about the companies he championed, the loud pitches, the relentless focus on disruption and scale. He thought about his own voice, so often the loudest in any room, asserting, judging, valuing. That performance tonight had been disruptive on a level he couldn't quantify. It had disrupted him. It had no business plan, no market strategy, sought no investment. Its value was intrinsic, immediate, and fleeting. And it had more power than any product launch he'd ever funded. He stood up and walked to the window. He realized a profound thing. He had spent his entire life looking at people and seeing what they could be, what he could make them into, for a return. He had looked at the waitress and seen a problem to be solved, a talent to be unlocked. But she was not a problem. She was a whole person, already complete. Her talent was not locked away. It was integrated into a life that had dignity and purpose on its own terms. She had shown him that some things are not meant to be scaled, acquired, or leveraged. They are meant to be felt, and then let go. He would probably go back to his world tomorrow. He would make deals, give orders, seek returns. But something had shifted. A new note of caution had been introduced, a willingness to listen for the music that wasn't trying to be a hit single. He knew he would never hear that particular piece played like that again. And that was okay. Its rarity was part of its gift. Asterisk, 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 a week later, on a quiet Tuesday night, the woman returned to work at the Orchid Room. Everything was the same. The same crisp linens, the same soft lighting, the same murmur of conversation. The grand piano sat in its usual spot. The regular pianist played his usual elegant set of jazz standards and show tunes. She worked her section, taking orders, delivering food, clearing plates. A few regular diners recognized her and gave her knowing smiles. She smiled back, friendly but professional. During one of her breaks, she walked past the piano. The pianist, a friendly man in his 40s, was taking a sip of water. He saw her and grinned. "Hey," he said. "Listen, any time you want to take over for a song or two. My hands could use the rest. Seriously, the floor is yours." She smiled, a genuine, easy smile. "Thanks. I might just take you up on that someday. But maybe something a little simpler." He laughed. "After what you pulled? Nothing is simple for you." She just shook her head and went back to work. The offer was kind, and it felt good. It felt like an open door, not an obligation. She could walk through it or not, on her own terms. At the end of her shift, as she was leaving, the maitre d' handed her a plain white envelope. "Left for you at the host stand," he said. Inside was a simple card. No name, no return address. On it was written, in a bold, decisive handwriting, **, thank you for the music," and for the silence that followed. **, she knew who it was from. She tucked the card into her notebook, which now had several new pages, filled with the dark blue ink from a very good pen. She walked home, the sounds of the city a gentle soundtrack around her. She wasn't thinking about the past anymore, or a phantom future. She was thinking about the next chord, the next line waiting to be written. The music was no longer behind her. It was ahead. And for now, that was exactly where she wanted it to be.